In 1958, Massey-Ferguson launched a tractor that would change farming forever. The MF-35 became so wildly successful that it sold over 500,000 units in just 8 years, making it the best-selling tractor in the world. Farmers loved it. Dealers couldn't keep them in stock. The company was printing money. But then, in a single catastrophic moment, everything came crashing down. One recall, one defect, and suddenly the empire that took decades to build started to crumble. If you want to see how companies rise to incredible heights only to watch it all fall apart, make sure you hit that subscribe button because stories like this don't get told enough. Let's go back to where it all started. Massey-Ferguson wasn't always called Massey-Ferguson. The company has roots going back to 1847, when Daniel Massey started making farm equipment in Newcastle, Ontario. His son, Hart Massey, expanded the business, and by the late 1800s, Massey Manufacturing was one of the biggest names in agricultural equipment. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a Scottish guy named Harry Ferguson was tinkering with his own ideas about how tractors should work. Ferguson wasn't just some mechanic. He was a visionary engineer who believed tractors needed a better hydraulic system to make implements work more efficiently. In 1938, he shook hands with Henry Ford himself to produce the Ferguson system on Ford tractors. No contract, just a handshake. That partnership eventually fell apart in spectacular fashion, leading to lawsuits and bad blood. But Ferguson kept going. In 1953, Massey-Harris merged with Harry Ferguson Limited, creating Massey-Harris-Ferguson, which later became simply Massey-Ferguson. This merger combined Massey's manufacturing muscle with Ferguson's brilliant engineering. It was a match made in agricultural heaven. The new company had factories across the globe, a brilliant product lineup, and access to markets that neither could dominate alone. Within a few years, they were positioned to launch something truly special. Enter the MF-35. When Massey-Ferguson introduced this tractor in 1957, it was like Apple launching the iPhone of farming. It wasn't the biggest tractor, it wasn't the most powerful, but it was perfectly designed for the average farmer. It had about 35 horsepower, which was ideal for small to medium-sized farms. It featured the Ferguson system, that revolutionary three-point hitch that made attaching implements easier and more efficient than anything else on the market. The engine was reliable. The design was simple enough that farmers could do their own maintenance. And the price? Affordable enough that it wasn't just for the big operations. This was a tractor for everyone. Farmers went absolutely crazy for it. In Britain, across Europe, in North America, Australia, and beyond, the MF-35 became the tractor to own. Massey-Ferguson couldn't build them fast enough. Production lines ran hot. Dealers had waiting lists. By the mid-1960s, over 500,000 MF-35 tractors had rolled off the assembly lines. That's an insane number for a single model. It dominated the market in a way few products ever do. Massey-Ferguson became synonymous with quality, reliability, and innovation. Farmers trusted the brand. If you were buying a tractor, you bought a Massey. It seemed like nothing could stop them. But here's where things get interesting. Success breeds complacency. When you're on top, when you're selling tractors faster than you can make them, quality control can slip. Corners get cut. Suppliers might not get the same scrutiny. Components that should be tested rigorously slide through because demand is so intense. And that's exactly what happened. Deep inside the MF-35, in the steering mechanism, there was a component that wasn't quite right. A small defect. A tiny weakness that wouldn't show up immediately. Most tractors worked fine for months, even years. But under the right conditions, that defect became deadly. Reports started coming in. At first, just a few. A farmer in Scotland noticed his steering felt loose. Another in Canada had a complete steering failure while working a field. Then more reports. Steering columns collapsing, tractors veering out of control. And then the worst thing that can happen to any product happened. Accidents, injuries, fatalities. People died because the steering on their MF-35 failed at the wrong moment. Imagine working your field, doing everything right, and suddenly your tractor won't respond. It's heading toward a ditch, a fence, a tree, and there's nothing you can do. For some farmers, that nightmare became reality. Massey-Ferguson faced a crisis unlike anything they'd seen. This wasn't just bad press. This was a fundamental safety failure on their flagship product. The tractor that built their empire was now killing people. The company had a choice. Now, they could try to quietly fix new models, offer repairs to anyone who complained, and hope the problem went away. Or they could do the right thing and issue a full recall. In the 1960s, recalls weren't as common as they are today. Admitting a defect meant admitting failure. It meant enormous costs. It meant reputational damage that might never heal. But Massey-Ferguson, to their credit, chose to recall the tractors. The recall was massive. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of tractors spread across dozens of countries. Massey-Ferguson had to contact owners, bring tractors in for inspection and repair, replace defective parts, and cover all the costs. The logistics alone were staggering, but the financial impact was even worse. The recall cost tens of millions of dollars at a time when that kind of money could break a company. Dealers lost confidence. Farmers who had trusted Massey-Ferguson for generations started looking at competitors. John Deere, International Harvester, Ford. Suddenly, those brands didn't seem so bad. Why risk your life on a Massey when you could buy something else? The damage went far beyond the immediate costs. Massey-Ferguson's reputation took a hit it would never fully recover from. In the farming community, word spreads fast. A farmer in Iowa talks to his neighbor. A dealer in England tells another dealer. Stories about the defective steering became legendary. Even after the recall, even after the repairs, the shadow of that failure lingered. Sales dropped. Market share eroded. The company that had been untouchable just a few years earlier was now scrambling to survive. They launched new models, tried new marketing strategies, cut costs wherever they could. But the magic was gone. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Massey-Ferguson struggled. They faced labor strikes, economic downturns, and brutal competition. The agricultural equipment market became tougher. Farmers were going through hard times themselves, which meant fewer tractor sales overall. Massey-Ferguson took on debt to stay afloat. They sold off parts of the business. They restructured over and over. In 1978, the company faced such severe financial trouble that they needed a government bailout. The Canadian and British governments stepped in to keep them alive, but it was humiliating for a company that had once been a global powerhouse. By 1994, Massey-Ferguson was acquired by AGCO Corporation, an American agricultural equipment manufacturer. The Massey-Ferguson name survived, and they still make tractors today under the AGCO umbrella. But it's not the same. They're no longer the dominant force they once were. The brand exists, but the empire is gone. A GCO uses the Massey-Ferguson name because it still carries weight in certain markets, especially internationally. Farmers in some parts of the world still swear by Massey-Ferguson tractors, but in North America, they're a shadow of their former selves. So, what can we learn from this? First, success is fragile. Massey-Ferguson went from the top of the world to near bankruptcy in less than 2 decades. One defect, one recall, and the entire trajectory died. It didn't matter that they'd built hundreds of thousands of reliable tractors. It didn't matter that they'd innovated and led the industry. One failure was enough to tarnish everything. Second, the quality control matters more than speed. When you're racing to meet demand, when production lines are running nonstop, it's tempting to let things slide, but that's exactly when you need to be most vigilant. A single defective component can undo years of hard work. Third, how you handle a crisis defines your future. Massey-Ferguson did the right thing by issuing the recall, but the damage was already done. If they'd caught the defect earlier, if their quality control had been tighter, the crisis might never have happened. Once you're in damage control mode, you're already losing. The goal is to prevent the crisis in the first place. Fourth, reputation is everything. In industries like agriculture, where trust and reliability are paramount, your reputation is your most valuable asset. Farmers don't just buy a tractor, but they buy the confidence that it will work when they need it, that it won't let them down during harvest, that it won't put their lives at risk. Once that trust is broken, it's almost impossible to get it back. The MF-35 itself is a fascinating artifact. Today, you can still find these tractors working on farms around the world. Many have been restored by enthusiasts who love the classic design and the historical significance. Vintage tractor shows often feature MF-35s, and they're beloved by collectors. Ironically, the very tractors that nearly destroyed the company are now cherished symbols of a bygone era. The ones that survived, the ones that were properly repaired, have proven incredibly durable. Some have been running for over 60 years. That's a testament to the fundamental quality of the design, which makes the defect all the more tragic. If only they'd gotten it right from the start. Massey-Ferguson's story is a reminder that no company is too big to fail. In the 1960s, they seemed invincible. They had the best product, the best reputation, the best sales figures. Competitors were playing catch-up, but all it took was one mistake, one overlooked defect, and the empire started to crumble. It's the same story we've seen with other giants. Kodak ignored digital cameras. Blockbuster dismissed streaming. Nokia underestimated smartphones. In every case, success bred complacency, and complacency led to downfall. There's also a human element to this story that's easy to overlook. Real people died because of that defect. Families lost fathers, sons, brothers. Farmers who trusted Massey-Ferguson paid the ultimate price. While behind the corporate drama, the financial struggles, the recalls and restructuring, there are real tragedies. It's a sobering reminder that when companies cut corners, when quality control fails, the consequences aren't just financial. People get hurt. Lives are destroyed. That's the real cost of failure. Today, the agricultural equipment industry is dominated by names like John Deere, Case YH, and New Holland. Massey-Ferguson still exists under AGCO, and they still make decent tractors. But they're no longer the leader. They're no longer the first name farmers think of when they need equipment. The MF-35, the tractor that was supposed to cement their legacy, instead became a cautionary tale. It's a story of ambition, innovation, incredible success, and devastating failure. So it's a story about how quickly things can change when you take your eye off the ball. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who loves business history, engineering disasters, or just great stories about companies that rose and fell. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We've got tons of content diving deep into the successes and failures of iconic brands. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. The fall of Massey-Ferguson also reveals something crucial about market dynamics that we don't often talk about. When a company dominates a market the way Massey-Ferguson did with the MF-35, they essentially set the standard for what customers expect. That they trained an entire generation of farmers to believe that their equipment represented the pinnacle of quality and reliability. That's both a massive advantage and a massive vulnerability. The moment that standard slips, the moment customers discover that the company they trusted completely has let them down, the betrayal feels even deeper. It's not just disappointment, it's a violation of faith. And in agriculture, where equipment failures can mean the difference between a successful harvest and financial ruin, that faith is everything. What's particularly interesting is how Massey-Ferguson's decline wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow erosion that took years to fully play out. The recall happened in the early 60s, but the company didn't get acquired until 1994. That's 3 decades of struggling, fighting, and trying to stay relevant. They released the MF-135 and the MF-235, which were improved versions designed to address the trust issues. They invested in new technology. They tried to modernize their image. But no matter what they did, they couldn't fully shake the stigma of that original defect. The steering failure became the lens through which everything else was viewed. When a new Massey-Ferguson tractor had a problem, people remembered the steering issue. When a competitor's tractor worked perfectly, farmers thought about how reliable those other brands were. The narrative had shifted, and Massey-Ferguson couldn't change it back. This teaches us something important about how industries work. In competitive markets, there are usually only a handful of players at the top. Massey-Ferguson, John Deere, International Harvester, and a few others fought constantly for dominance. When Massey-Ferguson stumbled, those competitors immediately seized the opportunity. John Deere, in particular, was incredibly aggressive in taking Massey-Ferguson's market share. They invested heavily in marketing, in dealer networks, in customer service. They made sure farmers knew that John Deere was the safe choice, the reliable choice, the choice that wouldn't let you down. By the time Massey-Ferguson had recovered from the recall and fixed the problem, John Deere had already entrenched themselves so deeply that reclaiming that market share was nearly impossible. The lesson here extends far beyond tractors. In any industry, your competitors are always waiting for you to slip. They're watching for any sign of weakness. The moment you have a quality issue, a safety problem, or a public relations disaster, they pounce. They use it as proof that you're not as good as you claim to be. And because humans tend to remember negative information more vividly than positive information, one mistake can undo years of building a positive reputation. Massey-Ferguson learned this the hard way. They'd spent a decade or more building up their reputation as the company that made the best tractors. The MF-35 was the embodiment of that reputation. One defect, and suddenly all of that goodwill evaporated. It's a brutal reality of business. There's also an interesting angle about timing and luck in this story. If the defect had shown up a year or two later, after production had slowed down and the MF-35 was past its peak sales period, the impact might have been less severe. If the accidents hadn't been so serious, as if no one had died, the company might have recovered faster. If the economic climate of the 70s had been stronger, Massey-Ferguson might have had more resources to weather the storm. But all of these things went wrong at once. The defect appeared while sales were at their peak. The accidents were fatal. The economy collapsed. It was a perfect storm, and Massey-Ferguson was caught right in the middle of it. Sometimes failure isn't just about making mistakes. Sometimes it's about bad luck hitting you at exactly the wrong moment. The people involved in this story are also worth thinking about. The engineers who designed the MF-35 were brilliant. They created something that was revolutionary for its time, something that solved real problems for farmers and made their lives better. While the executives at Massey-Ferguson who made the decision to issue the recall were making the right choice, even though it was expensive and painful. The farmers who bought these tractors did so because they trusted the brand and believed in the product. None of them wanted this outcome. None of them expected that their tractor would fail them so catastrophically. The tragedy of this story isn't just that a company fell. It's that good people, good products, and good intentions still couldn't prevent disaster because of one component, one defect, one oversight. From an engineering perspective, the irony is particularly sharp. The MF-35's hydraulic system, the Ferguson system that was supposed to be so revolutionary and so reliable, wasn't the problem. The defect was in the steering mechanism, a different part of the tractor entirely. So here was this brilliant engineering innovation, this system that had been perfected over years of development, and it got overshadowed by a problem in a completely different area. It's a reminder that a product is only as strong as its weakest link. You can have 99 things that are perfect, but if one thing is broken, that's what people will remember. That's what will kill you. The regulatory environment is another important piece of this puzzle. In the 1960s, there wasn't the same regulatory oversight that exists today. There were no mandatory recalls, no government agencies inspecting every batch of tractors, no independent testing organizations verifying safety claims. If Massey-Ferguson had wanted to, they could have tried to hide the problem, tried to quietly fix things without admitting there was an issue. Like some companies in that era did exactly that. The fact that Massey-Ferguson chose to issue a public recall was actually a sign of integrity, even though it was financially devastating. In today's world, that recall would have been mandated by law. A company wouldn't have the choice. But in the 60s, it was a decision made by the company itself. Whether that decision came from genuine concern for customer safety or from fear of lawsuits, we may never know. But either way, they did the right thing. What's also worth considering is how differently this story might have unfolded if social media and the internet had existed then. Today, if there's a defect with a major product, word spreads instantly. Videos go viral, hashtags trend. The story becomes national or international news within hours. The company is forced to respond immediately or face a complete public relations meltdown. In the 1960s, information moved much more slowly. Reports of the steering failures spread through word of mouth and industry publications. It took weeks or months for the full scope of the problem to become clear. By that time, Massey-Ferguson had already taken action. If this happened today, the speed of information would make it even more catastrophic. The company would face immediate pressure, immediate lawsuits, immediate calls for recalls. The modern media environment would have amplified the damage exponentially. The agricultural industry specifically is another crucial piece of context. Farming is one of the most conservative industries in the world. Farmers stick with brands and products that work. They pass down knowledge about equipment from one generation to the next. A farmer might use the same brand of tractor their father used, and their father before them. That's not just brand loyalty, that's cultural heritage. When you break that trust in agriculture, you're not just losing a customer, you're losing their entire family network. Word spreads in farming communities faster than anywhere else because farmers talk to each other constantly. They compare notes, share stories, warn each other about problems. That's actually how the steering defects became so widely known so quickly. Farmers were talking, and once they started talking about the problem, everyone in the agricultural community knew about it. Looking at modern agriculture, as we can see how Massey-Ferguson's recovery would have been even harder if these events had happened today. Nowadays, farmers have access to reviews online, to YouTube videos of equipment in action, to detailed specifications and comparisons. They can read about other farmers' experiences instantly. If Massey-Ferguson had a quality issue today, it would be documented, reviewed, discussed, and debated on countless platforms. The company would have essentially no way to control the narrative. Back in the 1960s, at least they had some control over how the story was told. The media didn't dig as deep. Information wasn't as democratized. In that sense, maybe they got a little bit lucky to be living in an era before the internet. But the recovery efforts that Massey-Ferguson attempted throughout the 70s and 80s were commendable in their own way, even if they ultimately failed. The company brought in new management. They modernized their factories. They invested in research and development. They tried to position themselves as a company that had learned from its mistakes and come out stronger. But perception is incredibly sticky. Even when you do everything right after a failure, people remember the failure first. It becomes the defining characteristic of your brand. Massey-Ferguson could have made the most reliable tractors in the world in the 70s, and farmers still would have been skeptical. The damage was done. The narrative was set, and no amount of subsequent quality or marketing could fully erase it. This story also has a lesson about the importance of redundancy and backup systems. The steering mechanism on the MF-35 was a critical safety system. If it failed, there was nothing to fall back on. The driver had no alternative way to steer the tractor. In modern vehicles, there are backup systems for critical functions. If power steering fails, you can still steer manually, it's just harder. If brakes fail, you have secondary braking systems. But on the MF-35, the steering failure was catastrophic and immediate. That's an engineering lesson that applies far beyond tractors. When you're designing any system that affects safety, you need to think about what happens if something goes wrong. You need redundancy, you need fail-safes, you need backup systems. Massey-Ferguson learned this lesson, but only after people had already died. Well, it's a lesson the entire industry had to learn. The legacy of the MF-35 is complicated and bittersweet. On one hand, it's remembered as a revolutionary tractor that changed farming forever. Farmers and historians recognize it as an important innovation, a vehicle that had real positive impact on agriculture. On the other hand, it's remembered for the defects that killed people. The MF-35 is permanently associated with safety failure in a way that no company wants their flagship product to be remembered. It's like if the iPhone had a major battery defect that caused fires. The innovation would still be recognized, but the product would be defined by that failure. That's the burden that the MF-35 carries into history. It was brilliant, but it was also broken. And for many people, especially those who lost loved ones, and that defect is the only thing that matters. The broader context of industrial history in the 1960s is also relevant here. This was an era when manufacturing was king. Industrial companies were the backbone of the economy. Factory workers had good jobs. Shareholders made money. The companies themselves were often run by executives who had worked their way up through the ranks and understood the business deeply. There was a certain pride in manufacturing, in making things that worked, in building products that would last. But there was also immense pressure to produce. Competition was fierce. Profit margins mattered, and that pressure sometimes led to corners being cut. Massey-Ferguson wasn't unique in having a quality control failure. Many companies in that era faced similar issues. The difference was in how visible it was, now how serious the consequences were, and how badly the company had been relying on their reputation to carry them. As we wrap up this exploration of Massey-Ferguson's rise and fall, it's important to recognize that this isn't just a historical story. It's a contemporary lesson. Companies today still face the same fundamental challenges. The tools and technology are different. The regulatory environment is different. But the core truth remains unchanged. Success requires constant vigilance. Reputation requires continuous investment. Quality is never something you can take for granted by mind. And when you fail, when you make a mistake, how you respond will define everything that comes after. Massey-Ferguson's story is a masterclass in what happens when companies let their guard down, when they prioritize volume over quality, when they assume their success is guaranteed. It's a story that every business leader should know, every entrepreneur should study, and every person interested in how industries work should understand. So if you've made it this far in our deep dive into Massey-Ferguson's remarkable journey, I really want to thank you. This is exactly the kind of story that makes history worth exploring, because it has lessons that apply regardless of what industry you're in or what era you're living in. If you enjoyed this exploration of how a giant fell, please smash that like button. Share this with your friends, especially if they work in manufacturing, quality assurance, or business management. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, this is your sign to do it now. We cover incredible stories like this all the time, on stories of innovation and failure, of triumph and tragedy, of companies that shaped industries and then disappeared into history. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.